from Zimbabwe Institute of Technology. Myself, welcome all of you on behalf of SIT for this technical talk series of embedded systems. So, welcome you all. Uh, as you know, embedded systems is becoming an all-pervasive technology in today's world. It is sweeping all domain areas like automotive, medical, industrial automation, consumer electronics. You take any domain today, and you will find embedded system at the core of this technology. So, and electronic engineers graduating today are engaged mostly by companies which work either directly or indirectly in the area of embedded systems. And the technology domains like IoT, robotics, all these domains have they must have embedded system designers at the core of their implementation teams, right? So product companies they also rely heavily on the innovative solutions which are built around embedded systems. So embedded systems is poised to become the largest demanding technology in the years to come. So with this increased focus on embedded systems in the current and future trends in the industry, the ANTC department of Zimbabwe Institute of Technology has started a technical talk series on embedded systems, and I welcome you all for this third talk in this series today. We already had two talks last month, and this is the third in this series. Before going ahead with the details of the today's technical session, I would please request Dr. Sumit Kumar, who is in charge of our MTech Embedded System program. I will request Dr. Sumit Kumar to give a brief introduction about Symbiosis Institute of Technology uh, to our guest speakers today and for the benefit of others. So, Dr. Sumit Kumar, over to you.
I am audible to you. My screen is visible to you.
Yes, you are audible, and yes, your screen is visible.
So let me introduce SIT to you. So we have beautiful campus at Lavle, Pune. You can see the hills here. What about our rankings? We are among the first engineering private colleges of the century as per the India Today ranking 2020. And we are among the second among the private engineering colleges in the West Zone as per the India Today. And as per the Outlook, we are first among the private engineering colleges in Pune and third among the private colleges in Maharashtra and 16th among the private engineering colleges in West Zone. So these are the great rankings of SIT Pune. We have these many programs. We have mechanical engineering with the intake of 60. We have computer science, BTech in computer science with the intake of 180. And we have BTech in electronics and telecommunication with the intake of 120. We have civil with the intake of 60. We have BTech in robotics and automation with the intake of 60. We have BTech in AI/ML with the intake of 60 and MTech 24. We have embedded system MTech with the intake of 18. And we have 240 plus PhD research scholars, which they are doing PhD in SIT. So these are the additional specializations of the branches. If you can see electronics and telecommunication, we have embedded systems, we have signal processing, mechatronics and automation, bioelectronic systems, optoelectronics and communication, sustainable energy devices and systems, and others for other branches. And these are the features of the SIT, Symbiosis Institute of Technology. We have students from the different countries, and we have great types with other foreign universities. So we have great internalization. We have internship programs with many companies. Students do internship of 6 months in BTech and 1 year in MTech. We have multicultural, vibrant on-campus life. We have project-based learning in our curriculum. We have BTech with honors that is introduced to the student in the 3rd year. We have conductive research environment, strong industry connect. We have MOUs with KPIT and others, focused development activities and holistic engineering curriculum. So this is the industry connect at ANTC. We have MOU with Philips, KPIT, and Spark Minda. We have teaching partnership. We have MATLAB. We have HFSS with us as a licensed tool. Another teaching partnership like Tata Communications, Cisco. We have research and development at DRDO at CSIR. And we have industry internship and major recruiters at Samir, Amazon, Tech Mahindra, and CDEC, right? So these are the expertise at the ENTC department. We have embedded system, VLSI design, robotics and control, artificial intelligence, solar photovoltaic, analog circuits, image and signal processing, communication technologies. These are the labs at the SIT, at the electronics department, robotics lab, embedded system lab, solar photovoltaic lab. These are the labs at SIT. Yeah, thank you. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sumit Kumar. So, dear participants, for the today's technical talk, we have from the industry an expert in embedded system design, Mr. Anurag Chugh. Mr. Anurag Chugh has worked at various MNCs and startups on embedded systems and system software. He has hands-on experience on developing device drivers and user space system software for Linux platforms. And currently, Mr. Anurag is working at Tarana Wireless on software that is responsible for interacting with the RF chain, high-speed ADC and DAC, RFICs, and their continuous calibration. Tarana Wireless develops and manufactures wireless equipment for fixed broadband access using unlicensed spectrum. So as you can see, Mr. Anurag is a really hands-on practical person on the embedded system domain. And today he's going to speak about a very interesting topic. He's going to talk about embedded system designs in few of the most commonly used devices. I'm sure this is going to be a very interesting and highly practical session. So I now hand over to Mr. Anurag, and over to you, Mr. Anurag.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just share my screen. Okay, so let's get started. Originally, my intention was to make a presentation about 10 different devices, but given the constraint of time, I cut them short to a few devices. But we are going to take a detour every now and then when we try to cover some concepts related to that particular device. So yeah, let's get started. So my focus would be to uncover some things about devices that you use on a daily life that you didn't know about. The issue that we face in any kind of field is if you want to acquire knowledge, you have to know what field or what concept you want to get at. But sometimes we don't even know the name of the concept. So you can't just go on Google and type and look it up because, like I said, you don't know that you don't know. So my aim with this presentation is to just make you aware of some concepts so that in the future, when you're trying to design embedded devices or repair them or just open them up for fascination, you would know what to look for and what to Google to know more about them. So here's the agenda. I'll talk about myself and how I got into this field, particularly why I chose this topic for this presentation today. I'll cite my sources because this is a heavy presentation in terms of images. So I'll put down all the sources where you can get those images and get the content for these. And then I'll cover four different devices in 4 different price categories. The cheap ones, which is the digital watches and calculators, which are in the price range of 100 to 100. Then we go to devices which are 10 times more expensive, which is smart board kind of single board computer kind of devices like Android boxes, feature phones, and so on. And then finally, another category of devices which are 10 times even more expensive, digital cameras. For every device, I will also mention other devices which are similar in construction and price range to the ones that we are talking about. So let's get started. So I graduated in 2002, and I used to carry my camera to the lab, and I had this cheap digital camera. We didn't have camera phones then, and I used to take photos of all the projects that I used to work on in the lab. So taking photos of electronics became a fascination of mine. And for my final year project, instead of making something new, I just tried to replicate a product because I wanted to test myself whether I can, uh, rep, given a product, I can make my own version of it. So you all know about Kaun Banega Crorepati. There's a system where the audience can submit votes for the contestant, and we try to replicate the similar system, although not wireless. Ours was a wired system, and we used Modbus there, which is a serial port kind of a technology with the cross uh, cross pair of cable, just like we use in Ethernet, so that there is less interference from external noise sources and less interference given out by the devices themselves. And you can run long lengths of cable without worrying about data corruption. Next, I worked at Larsen and Toubro. That was my first job. And with my first salary, I bought myself an oscilloscope. And then I started poking around various devices inside my house and in office, just to look at all the waveforms that one could observe. All the collection that I accumulated of different waveforms from various products, I actually put it up on my blog. I'll post the link later. Next, I worked at a startup where I wanted to build small widgets, which are just small circuit boards which can be put together to build any kind of a project. So this would help final year students to build an MP3 player or a calculator or a small project just for their final year project or any kind of mini workshop project. So in that case, you don't have to worry about the hardware. You only have to worry about the software. So this would make your life easier. Nowadays, there are many other websites which provide these services in India. There is sunrom.com or SparkFun in the US. You can buy these small circuits. You don't have to solder. You just put them together and create a project for your college, or like even if you are just an enthusiast. At the same place, the startup, I had a task of carrying out induction for new joinees. So like what better way than to get them to open up existing devices and look up the part numbers online and try to understand how the devices are put together. So we got them to open up MP3 players, and then they had to put everything together on a piece of transparent plastic and then point out the different ICs and the components in the device. After the startup, I worked at Tata Consultancy Services, which had been subcontracted the design of Sony's automotive infotainment systems. And later on, I worked at a startup which was working on power line communication, and that was my first foray into Linux, embedded Linux, and hacking. After that, I took a 2-year break and worked for an NGO called Teach for India, where I taught 7th and 8th grade students. It was like a full-time teacher job. And even there, I was able to get the students to open up old mobile phones and look up, to identify what parts were there. So my hope was that they would be better able to understand and engage with the devices that are present in their environment. For the next 1 year, I tried to work from a small family business unit. I tried to set it up, and we had this small product that we sold to dentists, which allows them to have a magnified look of the teeth of a patient, so they can work better and focus on a single tooth and look at the features while they're working. And finally, now I'm working at Tarana Wireless, where we design and manufacture high-speed RF. By high speed, I mean high bandwidth RF links for fixed wireless access. And this is a photo of one of the site field trials that we had in Hong Kong. Before I get into the different embedded devices, let me cite my sources so that if this presentation interests you, you can sign up or subscribe to those websites and look up devices in the future to satisfy your curiosity. The first one is SparkFun. SparkFun is a widget shop in the US where you can buy small circuit boards to put together your project. So it could be a small project like which a device that turns on your exhaust fan when a sensor that detects flame near your stove fires off. So you could have a wireless sensor near your stove and wirelessly connected to another microcontroller which is next to your exhaust fan. So you don't have to worry about turning on the exhaust fan. So if you want to put this project for yourself in your own house, you can buy small circuit boards, put them together with little amount of soldering, and then actually start working on the code. So those circuit boards are available from SparkFun, and there are many other websites in India as well. SparkFun has a separate section where they look into devices and look into various products and check out how they are designed. In this particular screen, you can see it's actually they were approached by the government to investigate a device where criminals were trying to copy credit card information from a petrol pump there. Next is Hackaday. Hackaday is an aggregator website wherein they post links to really cool blog posts that others have, blog posts or YouTube videos that different enthusiasts, DIYers and engineers have put up on their own blogs. So they mostly they don't have their own content, but they link to other people's content. And it's a good place to get news. iFixit is another website which sells spares and tools for repairing things on their own. And they have a lot of repair guides where they open things up and then explore what different components are there inside it. Finally, there's a magazine called EDN, Electronic Design News. And they have a column called Prying Eyes where they regularly open up devices and look inside them. And I also have my own blog where I seldom post some stuff. Like I mentioned earlier, one of my hobbies is to stick my oscilloscope in different products and look at the waveforms of the various signals which could be inside those devices. All right. So the first device that we'll talk about is a simple wristwatch. And we'll cover some concepts like chip on board, quartz crystal, and digital LCDs. So this is one of the most popular wristwatches, F91W. This has been in production for a very long time, and it's like one of the generic ones that became the most popular. So let's look inside it. Inside the watch, you have a plastic shell with the LCD, then you have a metal holder for the coin cell. And you have the circuit board with something which looks like a black blob on a circuit board. You have a few capacitors and a resistor. So let me mark out all the components. So you have the chip on board, capacitors, quartz crystal, piezoelectric buzzer, the one that rings the melodious beep when you wake up in the morning, resistor to go with the LED, a transistor to actually trigger the buzzer. You have a transistor because maybe the circuit logic IC below the black thing is not able to handle a higher current. So to ring a buzzer, you might need a higher current. So you put in a transistor there, and the transistor's gate is connected to the logic circuit. You have a few capacitor and you have a quartz crystal. You can see some of the components here are not populated. It's just because the semiconductor chip inside under this black top might already have them on board. So these two pads here are actually pads for capacitors that can go along with the quartz crystal, but they are not populated here. For the liquid crystal display to work, you have an elastomeric connector that we'll talk about later, which allows the connection between the LCD and the PCB. So let's look under the black blob that we saw earlier. There's actually a silicon chip on the PCB itself. You don't see any black IC that you see in the labs during your engineering times or during your lab sessions. But this chip is directly glued to the PCB, and they are wires bonded from the silicon to the traces on the PCB itself. They use a technique called thermosonic bonding where they apply ultrasonic sound waves and a little bit of heat. They don't want to apply a lot of heat because that would melt the silicon wafer and the wire metal along with it. So they had to figure out a technique where you could bond two different materials without melting them. there's a machine actually that exists for you to do this. They have a PC with a camera built in so that you can align your silicon, and then with a preloaded software and pre-configured points where you want to attach the wires, it goes around and connects the wires from the silicon to the board itself. Why do we do this? We want to decrease the cost. Instead of having a chip which is packaged, you just get the silicon die and install it on the PCB, and finally you cover it with a potting compound, also called an epoxy, and it looks like a black blob on the PCB. Another thing to note is that this epoxy needs to flow easily so that it doesn't cause the wires to short with each other, and it takes around 4 hours of curing in heat, under heat, for it to become hardened. You can see these glob tops in calculators and watches and many of the cheap devices, remote controls, and so on. And nowadays in India, I mean, this was probably 10 years ago. Nowadays, we all have cell phones, so we don't worry about this. But we had these small circuit boards you can see on the bottom right, which had a chip with the specific purpose of playing any kind of recorded audio. This audio could have been recorded beforehand and before it was mounted on the PCB. And you can just add a speaker. It had a built-in amplifier and LED or switches and all to trigger the audio which was in there. You would see these chips in devices like you see on the left side. They have various religious chants, bhajans that you can play in the morning when you turn on the device, or you might have heard in some of those irritating elevators where they keep repeating, please close the door, please close the door, if you don't actually close the door. And you might hear them again in the morning, very irritating, when people are trying to reverse their car and there's some weird sort of music coming out of the car. So all these chips are available in India. You can see on the right side, the price is just 7 rupees. And all you have to do is supply a speaker and you're good to go. Of course, there are other toys that you can build with it. The silicon chip inside it is also available as a dual inline package that you can work with on a breadboard or on a circuit board. And that is the same thing that goes in the toys that repeats whatever you say to it. So the device will actually record whatever you say and just play it back. So it has a microphone and a speaker that is connected inside the device. Let's talk about the quartz crystal now. So quartz crystal, just like the buzzer, is based on piezoelectric effect. You apply some voltage and it starts vibrating, and that vibration can be used to generate a waveform of a particular frequency. So the quartz crystal used in the wristwatch is 32.768 kilohertz. If you note, it's 2^15. So if you have a 16-bit counter, the most significant bit of your counter will toggle once per second, and that can be used to power your clock. Now, the question to ask is, why do we use 72.768? First of all, if the crystal ends up vibrating and it creates some noise, you will not be able to hear it because it's outside your audible range. At the same time, the piezoelectric buzzer that we saw on the watch, the one that beeps, the crystal is cut in such a way that it actually produces a audio frequency in the audible range. So same technology, different intentions. Also, 72.768 is, like I said, it's a power of 2 and just outside the audible range. But still, if you increase the frequency, the power consumption of the wristwatch will increase. So it's just low power enough for our purposes. The quartz crystal is also used in different other devices. Specifically, you can see there are batteries installed on your motherboard. Now, the intention for that is to have the real-time clock. There's a chip inside it which keeps time, and you don't want to log into your computer, turn on your computer every time and have it lose power because there are no electricity supplied to the circuitry there. So it'll stop keeping track of time. It'll stop, the oscillator will stop, the logic circuitry will stop, and so on. So what they do instead is they actually installed a small IC which keeps the time and a battery along with it. And that IC again has the same 32.768 kilohertz clock. So you would see these clocks in computer motherboards. You'll see it in the dash cam. Dash cameras are cameras that you install in a car, not very popular in India yet, but that helps you, that records everything that you do on the road, so that if there's an accident, you have some proof of how it went wrong and so on. So dash camera needs to store the time, have a timestamp on the video, and you need the time on the digital camera as well. So you know when you took the photo and on what date. So RTC is like a wristwatch for the computers, and it's just a chip that you install in a computer, and it has a serial interface to the main processor, and it can query, the processor can query the chip for time regularly. Talking about microwave ovens, you can see there's a clock on the microwave oven, but there's no RTC chip inside it. So every time there's a power failure, the time will reset back to 12. So that's the most irritating part about the microwave. But like I said, people just try to save cost, and maybe if people, if you are enthusiastic or determined enough, you can hack a microwave with a Raspberry Pi or a Wi-Fi capable microcontroller, which will set the time automatically when there's a power after a power failure. So I have a few links here where people have done that to their own microwave. It's all about cost saving. So even if a device has a display, that display is supposed to show you time for the cooking, you can double it up to show a clock. But to actually make use of it as a clock, you actually need to solve the problem, which is in case of power failure, you actually need the time to work properly. So if you have a Wi-Fi capable microcontroller in there, even if you don't have a battery, it's fine, because the Wi-Fi capable microcontroller can query one of the computers on the internet for the time and set it up when the microwave comes on. Another question that you might think of that might come to your mind is, like in our engineering times, engineering college days, we start off with 8051 microcontroller, one of the first microcontrollers that Intel came up, and now many different manufacturers have come up with their own versions of 8051. The question is, why do we use 11.0592 megahertz crystals? So when 8051 came out, when 8051 came out, the maximum operating frequency was 12 megahertz. So what they wanted was a crystal that could work very close to the maximum operating frequency, but also support the UART baud rates. So earlier, the UART, the serial port that you use to communicate with the microcontroller, came out because they wanted to use modems to transfer data over the telephone cables. And the baud rates were decided depending on the modulation that you use to transfer symbols over the telephone wire. Now, as you know, telephone wires don't have the full spectrum of 20 to 20 kilohertz that we have. So because the amount of spectrum, that is the bandwidth required for transferring voice over the telephone system, is just 600 to 3000 hertz. So like I said, the system is band limited. There are filters to filter out everything other than this frequency range. So if you want to fit different kind of different symbols into this, you would use different modulation that will ensure that signals don't spill out of this band. And hence, depending on the modulation that you use, you would get these different baud rates, the symbol rates, 9600, 19200, and so on. Now, if you look at 11.0592, which is 11.11,059,200, these different baud rates divide this particular frequency completely without leaving a remainder. So it allows you to have a nice serial communication without any errors in the bit. So we ended up using this particular crystal. Nowadays, you can use higher speed crystals, 22.118 something, and you can still get those same baud rates. Also, nowadays, people don't worry about the lower speed. They all operate their microprocessors and microcontrollers at 115200 baud rate whenever, especially during the development time when they want to debug as the system is booting or there's some software failure, serial port comes in handy. Let's look at the liquid crystal display now. You saw that the crystal display is separate from the PCB, and there's some kind of a rubber element between the two. If you look closely, the rubber element, also called an elastomeric connector, is just alternating strips of insulating rubber, and the same rubber silicon doped with kind of carbon so that it is conductive. So if you look closely on the right side, on the bottom, there are PCB traces, the golden traces that you see on the top left, the one marked in red. The same image is blown up and shown on the bottom right. The dark gray on the PCB, its width is larger than the width of the zebra connectors. That's what they are called. So these zebra connectors, you can see there is at least one insulating vertical plane between the vertical stripe between the two pads which are next to each other on the PCB. So this allows insulate passing signals from the PCB to the LCD, but at the same time, it prevents the short circuit between the PCBs. Sometimes you might get LCDs which don't have elastomeric connectors, which have direct metal pins on them. And as we have seen, LCDs can be made up of 7 segments that we see on a daily basis, but they can also have more segments to display the full alphabet if required. Then you get LCDs which have dot matrix, and they can produce any kind of font. And it's fairly quite easy to interface with microcontroller nowadays. They have their own LCD controller and it has built-in fonts and memory. If you want to create your own font or own character, there are websites that allows you to generate code and include it in your own project. This particular LCD shown on the screen actually uses a parallel interface, which ends up hogging a lot of pins on the microcontroller. Nowadays, you get LCDs which use fewer pin. On the bottom right, you can see they are just using a single pin other than the ground and VCC. And you can display all sorts of graphics that you can store in your own microcontroller's memory and then show it as an image on the LCD. So let's look at how LCDs work. So LCDs are based, they make use of 2 concepts, polarization and liquid crystals. Polarization is when you have 2 different materials, and when the light passes through them, it actually rotates, or the polarization material allows only a light of a particular polarization to pass through, meaning their electrical fields are oscillating along the same axis that the material is looking for. So if on the right side, if you have a light that passes through one polarization filter and the other one is 90 degrees, so it'll allow light only that light which matches the polarization of that filter to pass through. But the second polarization filter, if it is 90 degree out of phase with the previous one, it will block the light. So we can make use of 2 polarization filters in LCD, which are sandwich liquid crystals between them. Liquid crystals are some chemicals which exhibit properties of both liquids and solids. So if you apply electricity, they will change some property of theirs, and that is what can be used to display characters on the LCD. So when a liquid crystal display is made, you have a front polarizer and the rear polarizer on the top and bottom, and both of them are 90 degrees out of phase. So if you pass light through it, it'll actually get blocked by default. But we have this metal container here, and it is full of liquid crystal fluid, and they are arranged in such a way that there are multiple planes or layers of the molecules. So in each layer, the liquid crystal will act as a solid, and all the molecules will align in a certain way. And as you go down the layer, the molecules slowly rotate, are stored as in that fashion. And whenever the light passes through the front polarizer will filter out all the light which is not matching its own polarization angle, allow the light to pass through, and the liquid crystal will actually rotate the plane of light right, so that by the time it reaches the rear polarizer, it will match. So it will rotate the light in this particular case through 90 degrees, because the front polarizer and rear polarizer are vertical and horizontally polarized. So it will actually rotate the light so that it is able to pass through the rear polarizer. But if you apply an electric field, as you can see on the bottom, all the molecules line up in the same direction, and they no longer are able to rotate the light. So the light will actually pass through the front polarizer, but it will not be able to pass through the second one. and it won't be able to reflect off the back of the LCD, and then it'll appear as a dark element to you. If you want to add color, you can just add light next to it, LEDs, color filters next to it, and you can have a white light which contains all the colors, and you can block different pixels using the LCD liquid crystals between the two polarizer, and if the light is blocked, that particular pixel will appear off, and that particular dot will appear off, and a collection of red and green and blue dots will form a particular pixel. Also, you can control the brightness of the light which passes through by actually oscillating the signal that is applied to the LCD. So in essence, what it'll do is it'll turn the LCD on and off so fast that you can modulate the intensity of light perceived by you by changing the duty cycle of the square wave that is applied. Now, what's so complex about liquid crystal displays? The issue is that you cannot directly connect them to the microcontroller. You need some kind of driver circuitry there. Why? Because it actually requires negative voltage, and it's better if you apply an AC signal, because if you apply a DC signal like you do with LEDs in small projects, if you apply DC signals to LCD, what will happen is over time it will burn off, and the liquid crystal won't be able to align and go back to their original rotation when you remove the electricity. So what you need to do is you need to have a driver IC, and you can see on the right side, just focus on segment 1 and 0. Segment 0 is on, segment 1 is off. So that means voltage is applied to segment 0. How you do that is there's a common pin, you apply some square wave to it, and the segment that you want to turn on, you apply the opposite of that square wave, so that finally the voltage that actually appears across the segment is actually a AC square wave of twice the amplitude. For the segment that you don't want to turn on, you apply the same square wave that you apply to the common pin, and the voltage appearing across that segment will be 0. So on the bottom left, you can see there's a microcontroller attached to the driver IC, which is finally attached to the LCD. If there are different, if a driver IC is much more capable, it might have multiplexing logic to allow you to save pins on the microcontroller. So on the left side, you can see there are just 3 pins controlling a driver, and the driver IC is able to control multiple digits. And to display different numbers or alphabets on the screen would require you to have a lookup table which says, okay, if this is the number that you want to display, turn on so and so segment. So the lookup table can be inside your microcontroller, or if it's a better driver IC, it could be inside the driver IC itself. The lookup table itself might be programmable if you have certain special symbols or characters on the LCD that you want to turn on and off under certain cases. There's a very good application note by Microchip, and I've linked to it on the bottom of the slide. All right, let's move to the next device, the next cheap device that we see in our lives every day. If any of you were inspired by the movie Swades, and if you feel like you should go to some villages and have knowledge to at least set up some local, help them with some local electronics or energy generation, then the first thing that you should do is open up a desktop calculator, because as an engineer, the wristwatch and a desktop calculator are the most easiest embedded systems and most ubiquitous. They're present everywhere to open up and study before you move on to more complex things. So I think as part of our 4A engineering course, towards the end, a person should be able to design a clock and a calculator, and only then that would give you confidence to move on to bigger things and solve the world's problems. So for me, Shah Rukh Khan going to the village and setting up a turbine is equivalent to me trying to build my own calculator and a clock and deriving some pleasure out of it. So in the clock, we already know that there are LCDs and there are keypad LCDs, same as the wristwatch. But let's look at the other components of the desktop calculator. So you have the LCD display, solar cells in some calculators because they don't consume so much power. So it's better to just put a solar cell so the internal battery is conserved. You have another globe top and you have the keypad matrix with rubber keys. Let's look at it in the detail. This particular calculator made by Casio just cost 400 or 500 rupees. And there are other calculators which cost 141 rupees or lower than that. Now, the way to save money is to have cheapest possible components. So in this particular LCD, you can see instead of pins or elastomeric connectors, they have a black flexible PCB connecting the LCD to the circuit board itself. So this is stuck using some kind of heat and glue or pressure, and just to save cost. The keypad itself is made of the same elastomeric connector that we saw earlier. You have silicon rubber and some silicon rubber with conductive carbon patches, so that on the left side, if those patches or the keys they press on the PCB, they will make a connection. In this particular image, you can see there's a block top and a few resistors and capacitors. On the right side, you have the flexible connector that connects the PCB. You can see the zebra kind of pattern there, conductive and non-conductive alternating stripes. This is a large scale integration, not VLSI, just LSI, application specific integrated circuit, just a silicon chip inside a black epoxy drop. And the plastic shell of the calculator is made in something called a plastic injection machine, where hot molten plastic is passed through a mold. And when the mold is opened up, the plastic has already taken the shape and cooled down. You also have the lithium cell and the solar cell there. Some of the components here are through hole, but to decrease the form factor, they have cut out a hole, and you can see the profile of the diode is depressed into the PCB so that it becomes thinner. One question to ponder about is, why does the layout of the numbers on a cell phone or a phone match? Why doesn't it match the same on the calculator? So on the calculator, you have the higher digit 7, 8, 9 on the top, but on the phone, you have 1, 2, 3 on the top. So in the previous, when I was talking about clock, I was talking about why do we use 11.0592 megahertz crystal. I talked about the standard baud rates. The same body, International Telecommunications Union, came up with this standard saying that the telephone digits have to be ordered in this way because it's the most natural. When you're dialing numbers, you expect to find them in sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. So they came up with this standard layout, which people started using. But when the first calculators came out, we were still using the rotary dialing telephones, landlines. And at that time, people thought the calculator need to have 0 closer to the user, because 0 is the most used digits, like the multiplier. So since then, we have different layouts that are stuck because of different use cases. But let's look at how matrix keypad works. So we have different kinds of matrix keypad. You might have seen some of these in your daily life on older landline phones or on the ATM machine, or even on your microwave oven, where you have these plastic like flat panel and you touch and you can feel a certain something getting depressed and the key getting pressed. So on the microwave, the keys that you have are called membrane keys. Then you can have mechanical switches. Some of us use mechanical keyboards, so they could have mechanical switches, and then you have these tactile switches. But regardless of how they are, and you can have those carbon dots and the PCB switches as well. But regardless of how they are constructed, the internal schematic is the same. You have rows of conducting wire or conducting traces, and you have the columns, and the switches are arranged between the rows and columns. So if you press any particular switch, one of the rows and one of the columns will get shorted. And you can use microcontrollers to read this. Now, one obvious way to read this would be, say, for example, I set row 1, 2, 3, and 4. I connect all the 8 pins to my microcontroller. I set all the rows to, say, a logic high, and try to read which pin on the columns goes high when the switch is pressed. So if a particular switch, say this one is pressed, and I apply logic high to the rows and read the logic from the columns, I will see that C3 goes high. And now I switch roles. I apply the high logic to columns and I read the rows, and I'll see that R3 goes high. Now, this seems a pretty obvious way to go about reading this, but you have to understand that you can't just leave the pin floating, meaning when a switch is not pressed, for example, when you were trying to read column number 3, the column 1, C1, C2, and C4 were actually not connected to any kind of logic level. They were just floating. They were just pins or the tracks on the PCB out there. Now there's so much radio frequency noise in our environment, and those pins can pick up some noise and actually trigger logic high or logic low on your microcontroller. We don't want that. So what we do is we put up a resistor from that input of the microcontroller to VCC, or in some cases to ground, so that all the spurious noise that gets induced into the traces, which are now acting like radio antennas, get shorted to get drained out and don't disturb the logic sensed by the microcontroller. Older microcontrollers did not have built-in programmable resistors, so we had to put resistors outside. So if we do that, we no longer can use this kind of method to first scan the rows and the column. We use a different method, which is we actually connect 4 resistors to the say either the rows or the columns, and we pull them up to your VCC. Could be 3.3 volt or 5 volt logic depending on your system. And then what you do is you sense only the columns, like in this case PC7 to PC4, and wait for some key to be pressed. So you can connect them to your interrupt and just wait for the interrupt to come. So the CPU or the microcontroller can execute its own software, keep doing its own thing without consuming a lot of power. There's a block inside the microcontroller. It is waiting for some pin to get changed. And when it does, it'll wake up the microcontroller, and there's some interrupt service routine which will run. Now, what this service routine what you do is you apply logic 0 and wait for the interrupt. You apply logic 0 to all the rows, and you try to wait for interrupt on all the columns. So if someone presses a switch, that particular one of the columns will get pulled down, and I'll create an interrupt. The interrupt service routine can go and now turn off each and every row one by one. Like first it'll stop applying logic 0, it'll start applying logic 1 to all the rows, and then go one by one to each row, apply logic 0, and try to check which row caused one of the columns to go down. You already know which column sensed the pressing of the switch because it switched from 1 to 0, and now you know which row to look at, and from that you can find out the XY coordinate of the key pressed. There is a flowchart to go along with it. So this does 2 good things. One is you can use your interrupts and not worry about the processor continuously executing some software to read the key. And secondly, you can easily scan, do the processing in the interrupt service routine itself, and you don't have to worry about pull-up resistors being inside the microcontroller itself. So if you're still using an old 8051 and there is no pull-up resistor, you can still scan the keyboard. There's another issue when trying to read switches. One, it's called switch pantsing. So when you try to turn on a switch, it'll mechanically vibrate before it settles down. So on the oscilloscope, it looks something like this. You'll see fluctuation. And if you have an interrupt service routine hooked to the pin, hooked to this logic, it'll actually fire multiple times before finally settling down. So to decrease this issue, this is what it looks like on an oscilloscope. The top portion is the switch actually bouncing, and the bottom is the logic sensed by the microcontroller for those switches. So you can see there are lots of vibrations or ringing in the waveform as it switches from high to low. So the way to solve it is you can do something about it in the hardware. You can add some flip-flops or RC circuit, and along with RC circuit, you can also add a Schmitt trigger. Schmitt trigger is a NOT gate which fires at different threshold. It transitions from 0 to 1 at a different threshold from 1 to 0. So your RC circuit can decay out the ringing, and your Schmidt trigger can then switch between the logic very neatly and cleanly. You can also use a flip-flop. But in case of our key, we can't use any of these hardware methods. What we do is we use interrupts. And the moment that interrupt is fired, we wait for a time, or we have a state machine which tries to read the switch multiple times, and until and unless the switch is stable, it will not register, pass that on to the remaining software as a valid key press. So Hackaday, the website that I talked about, actually organized a competition where they asked different people to submit their own software debouncing logic, and they posted it on their website. Another way that people, different manufacturers use to read switches to try and save pins or software cycles on the microcontroller is by using an ADC pin. So Sony actually uses this in their TV. I don't know if they use it now, but they did use it like 10 years ago. So what they did is, instead of connecting it to a digital input pin, they'll connect it to an analog input pin, and they'll create this voltage divider. And you have different switches tapping out from different points in the voltage divider. So if you say press program plus or program minus, or if you say press one of the button on the TV, what will happen is it will shout out the remaining pins in the chain to the ground. So what will happen is there will be some voltage appearing across this ADC input, which will be specific to this particular voltage divider now, R0 on top and R1 and R2, R1 plus R2 on the bottom. So if you have a lookup table where you have different voltage ranges, you can figure out which pin was used. The advantage of which button was pressed. The advantage is that you can use a single pin to read multiple switches. This is not like a matrix keypad, but like if you have fewer keys, but even fewer number of pins on a microcontroller, you can do this. Now the issue with this, if you are in Mumbai where the weather is quite humid, is that the switches which are soldered onto the PCB, they might develop a resistance of their own. There might be some corrosion, or if it's a carbon rubber keypad, it might get deteriorate and develop some resistance of their own. Now what will happen is, instead of having a short here, you might end up having a resistor here, and this will mess up the voltage that appears at the ADC input pin. And on some cases, what will happen is the television will recognize this as some other switch. So you might be trying to change the program, but because there's an extra resistance here, it might think that it is program plus instead of program minus. Like higher resistance might appear in the resistance change than intended for that particular switch, and wrong voltage will appear to the microcontroller, and that will cause one switch to actually fire some other logic inside the microcontroller. So the way to fix it is just to replace the switches, so that replace the button, so that the old one, which is corroded, can be removed and it does not have any resistance anymore. One good thing about calculator is, like I said, it's actually fairly easy to characterize. We have used calculator all our lives. We know exactly how it behaves, the inputs and outputs, and so on. So unlike what happens later in the software industry, where there is a lot of to and fro and discussions on the requirements of your projects, and they keep changing and so on, when you're trying to build the calculator as your first project, you're very clear about the inputs and output and how it is supposed to behave. So building a calculator, like I said, is a good first embedded project to have. And in fact, I would say it's a good first programming project if you don't want to worry about the hardware itself. There are lots of kits available, like this one from SparkFun and many from Indian manufacturers as well. You can put things together. There's a microcontroller on it, and you can program the microcontroller at your home using a small cheap USB programmer, or you can just get started right away writing C++ or C# or Python code, building a calculator. Now, the best way to implement a calculator is using state machines. State machines are very underrated. Once you get into the industry and start working on software, you will realize that having had some experience building designing state machine, and before you actually got into coding, would have been a good idea. So calculator is a good first project to start with. When you think about it, what is happening is, to your state machine, different events are coming and you want to design the states correctly to capture all the events and to ignore invalid events that can happen. One advantage of designing good state machine is it helps you express your solution for a particular programming problem easily to others. So when you start working at in industry, you would want to convince your colleagues to or get your colleagues to review your code. But before they get to the code, if you have a good design ready, they can actually criticize it and help you improve it so that fewer bugs end up in your end product. Because if you become responsible for the bugs, you don't want to be that guy and someone that everyone else blames for carrying the bug into the system and so on. So if you design your system nicely using proper documentation techniques, state machine being one of them, timing diagrams being other, and flowchart and so on, it just helps prevent mistakes later on. So how do you implement state machine in C programming or any other kind of programming language? In college, like when I was back in college, 2002 to 2006, I actually missed out on learning design patterns. I had taken electronics engineering and not computer science. And I missed out on reading about design patterns, which is standard frameworks or templates on how to solve regular problems in software using object-oriented languages. Nowadays, you have design patterns for embedded systems as well. So if you want to implement, for example, if you want to implement state machine, there are multiple ways to do it, but one of them is the best way for a given situation. And that is what you should use, because that'll help you prevent bugs and make it easier for others who work with you or will come after you to maintain the code and so on. So if you have a simple, you can use conditional logic like if-else statements to implement state machine, or you can use a nested switch case where the outer switch case will switch on the different states and the inner switch case will switch on different events. So let's look at some of them. In Linux implementation of TCP/IP, we have the usual if-else statements implementing the TCP/IP state machine. This is actual code from the Linux kernel. So you can see there's C programming, and there is making use of structures and pointers, but most of it is if-else statement. They have written properly named functions that are called in different cases so that the code is more readable. But other than that, at a higher level, you're just using if-else statements. The other option that I talked about is you switch on the current state in an outer switch case statement, and in the inner switch case statement, you switch on the event that was just received. The issue with this is, for every state, each and every event could be valid, and in some cases you don't want that. So you want some events to not be valid for some state, and there are other unwanted transitions that you want to prevent. So also, this whole state machine is located inside a single function. So it's like a big function that you call and so on. Something better would be to actually make use of lots of enums and structures and function pointers, and then use some preprocessor defines to help you make your code simpler and faster. So now if you look at the code, you have states, you have declared these functions associated with states and events, and the code just looks easier and easier for anyone to understand. And then you can go on and populate the function bodies later on. So this is another way of doing this. All right, let's move on to the next device. This is our device in the next higher price category, Android TV boxes. And we'll talk about single board computers and the level of integration in the ICs used in these devices. So let's open one up. First of all, in case you don't know what an Android TV box is just a box that you add to your TV. If your TV is non-smart, you add the box and it'll allow you access to different apps. Airtel has come out with its own box, which has Android inside it, and you can have all the OTT apps in it. So again, the device that we are going to explore is similar to what Airtel has. You have the USB connectors on the back side, SD card, HDMI networking. It also has Wi-Fi inside it in case you want to use Wi-Fi, but they have put Ethernet just in case. You have audio output in two forms. You have analog audio that you can connect to your speakers, or if you have a high definition home theater system, there's an optical fiber output that is not for carrying your internet data. It is actually for outputting audio using optic fiber cable, a standard which was created by Sony or Philips back in the day. But nowadays, we stream audio along with video through HDMI itself, so we don't have to worry about the audio or the optical here. So this device has lots of features, like I said, Wi-Fi, USB, and it can decode video in hardware so that it runs faster, consume less power. So the processor that is inside there, if you look at the circuit board, there's a processor there. It has a lot of features, a multi-core processor. We call it a system on a chip, and it has a GPU, and it also decodes MP3, MP4, and different kinds of audio and video format in hardware. Other than that, there's a very high level of integration. By integration, we mean we bring on the features which are implemented using different ICs and put them all into a single chip. So you have the CPU along with HDMI, Ethernet. Ethernet is a chip that would have otherwise been outside the CPU, but now they've brought it inside. There's also a camera interface. So it means that this chip was actually intended for use in smartphones, but you can use it in Android TV boxes. Essentially, both of them use the same kind of connector, same kind of operating system. So it's really fine. Let's look at some of the other, let's look at some of the blocks inside the CPU itself. So you have the 4-core ARM processor, you have 5-core GPU, then on the bottom right, the red thing, you have audio output blocks. So you can output the audio on HDMI or analog out, as I mentioned. And you have other input-output devices, input-output interfaces that you have also on microcontrollers. So you have the one important one here is the infrared transmitter and receiver. So because you have a remote control to control the Android TV box, you need an infrared receiver as well. So this particular chip has a huge list of features inside it. We don't really care about all of them. We only care about a few of them. So we have highlighted the important features. So you can see the various codecs, various formats that the video, that the chip can help you decode in the hardware itself. So YouTube, if it supplies you MP4 format videos, the video will actually be decoded in the hardware. The CPU does not have to be consuming a lot of power to run some software algorithm to display it on the screen. It uses DDR3 RAM, and it has integrated Ethernet interface. It also has cryptography support. So if you want to prevent hackers from trying to copy movies from your OTT platform, you can have some encryption in the hardware itself. And that is what this device uses. Let's look at the other components on the board. You have the Wi-Fi chipset. So this is actually a small PCB soldered onto the base PCB. Essentially, this whole thing is a single board, is what we call a single board computer. So the computer has the components required to actually form a general purpose computer similar to what you have on a laptop, in your laptop or desktop. So the Wi-Fi chipset has its antenna here. The antenna is just a flat piece of plastic from the outside, but internally it has a metal foil which actually matches the frequency for the 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi in this particular case. So this chip is actually connected to the USB interface. You don't see any USB connector here, but on the PCB traces, it goes to this processor. The processor is running Android, which is essentially Linux kernel. And so you'll have the drivers for it running inside the CPU. This particular chip is actually very popular, made by Realtek and been used in lots of devices. The only thing is it's not very powerful in the sense that it still uses the older standard. It doesn't use the newer higher speed standard, and it only operates on 2.4 gigahertz. So it uses a single antenna. This particular device uses this particular board uses this device, and it has a single antenna. But you can have multiple antennas if you want to increase the bandwidth, the beam forming capacity of the device. It allows you to carry higher speed, use higher speed internet in your homes. Next, we have the DDR3 RAM chips. So they are the chips are specified in the number of bits they have. So each of them have 4 gigabits. You divide by 8, you get total of 1 gigabyte of RAM. So these chips are actually having their pins on the bottom side. So one way to save cost is to have a machine go and place each and every component, the resistors, the chip, and everything on the PCB. It's a robotic machine. You put it in, pick and place machine. It'll pick devices or components from a tray and put it on the PCB. And that PCB is then put in an oven where the different the little solder balls on the back side of the PCBs melt and actually get soldered onto the on the back side of the chips, get soldered onto the PCB. So such kind of chips are called ball grid array, and you can have many number of signals going from the chip to the PCB itself. Again, you have another memory, which is the flash memory, which actually has the Android software inside it. This one has a higher capacity than the RAM. It has 8 gigabytes, so you can have all your apps and maybe your content also stored there. And finally, you have all these connectors, the miscellaneous peripherals. So you have the 5-volt input, and then you have the optical audio output, which most of us don't use because we have HDMI going for us. And then you have the transformer for the RJ45. The Ethernet chip is not required, like I said, because the functionality is integrated into the CPU itself, but you have to supply some transformer from outside. If you're using headphones, you need an operational amplifier for the left and right stereo channels. And then you have the USB connector and SD card. On the left side, you also have the infrared receiver. This is what the circuit looks on the back side. They try to place all the components only on one side. So the pick and place machine can place the component from one direction from the top, and you don't have to worry about soldering anything on the back side, because of course you would think that there is an issue if you try to solder. You try to place component on one side, you put it in an oven, they get soldered. But if you try to place component on the other side now, and you try to put it in the oven, the component on the other side will get soldered, but on the previous side, they'll start falling off because the solder will melt and they'll get detached from the PCB. So it's a better idea if you want to save cost, manufacturing cost, place all the component only on one side. Let's look at some other single board computers like the Apple TV, which is the same thing which is exactly similar to what Android TV does in functionality. Apple has their own apps, and you have the OTT platforms. You can watch TV, you can stream music from your phone or your laptop, and so on. So just that Apple products are better built. So I wanted to put this here. Again, these photos are from iFixit. iFixit is a website where they teach you to open things up and try to repair it yourself. So let's look at the circuit board. Okay, first, on the right side, the round thing is actually the fan, because this can actually get warmed up. In Android TV, we did not have any fan because the processor was not expected to be running any heavy software. In case of Apple TV, Apple has their own processor, and they have a gigabit Ethernet controller. They wanted high-speed Ethernet, so they put an Ethernet controller outside, which is the orange thing here. You have the RAM here in yellow, and then there are some other glue logic that Apple made, which has its own memory controller in green. And then nowadays you get a single chip which has Bluetooth and Wi-Fi in it. Sorry, this is the blue one here. So in a single chip, you can have both the standards for the 2.4 gigahertz or 2.4 gigahertz, which is Wi-Fi and Bluetooth itself. Also, you have 32 GB flash memory for the software, the iOS, whatever resides in the device. These are the various components of the device. There's another circuit board with the power supply. So you apply 230 volts or 110 volts, and it actually converts it into the lower 3.3 volts or 1.8 volt logic that is required by the device. by the logic CPU board. Other single board computers that you might come across and you might have used or would be using is the Raspberry Pi, which is a small circuit board. It has the same layout, same components here. But a thing to note here is you don't see RAM chip here, because now even the RAM is inside the CPU. The CPU itself is lower performance, 1 gigahertz single core, but it has the RAM inside it. You don't have the RAM outside. You don't have flash memory here because you are expected to boot from a micro SD card having Linux inside it. And this small rectangle here has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth in it. On the PCB, you can see there are some traces. You don't see any component, but there are some traces that act as Wi-Fi and Bluetooth antenna. So you don't have to attach a wire separately. But in case you want to, this yellow block here is you can mount a connector here and add a antenna. Since this is a DIY board, they wanted to have the facility there. Wi-Fi routers, again, same category. Single board computers, you have the processor, you have the flash. The processor themselves might have RAM inside it. You have lots of transformers for various Ethernet connectors on the back. So this is one of the cheaper routers. But if you have a more expensive one of the kind that Cisco makes, they are well engineered. They have multiple antennas. You can see coaxial cable on the left side. The circuitry is inside a Faraday cage, which prevents transmission and reception of spurious signals which are not of interest and you don't want them to interfere with your circuitry. So the previous device had like maybe 8 or 16 MB of, or maximum 32 MB of RAM, but this one has 128 MB of RAM. Also, it has a flash memory which is partitioned into two parts. So if the firmware in one gets corrupted, you can boot from the other part. And the CPU here runs at a much higher speed of 1.2 gigahertz. So if you open the Faraday cages with the metal parts, you'll see the processor and the Wi-Fi chipset underneath it. And on the top side, you can see RAM and flash on the left side, another RAM and flash on the right side. So there are two partitions, two parts to the router. So you can flash software in either one of them. Yeah. Nowadays, you also get cheaper Wi-Fi capable microcontrollers, but with application processor on them. So this is a breadboardable unit with the processor that can run Linux that is present under the metal enclosure. And on the bottom side, you have the AVR microcontroller there. So the processor on the top runs Linux, a variety called OpenWRT, and you can write some small C application or your own software there to do whatever kind of DIY or projects that you want to have running there. But you also have microcontroller underneath, so you can have sensors connected to it and so on. You can you can install SD card here and save some files if your application requires it, since you have the full force of Linux going on here. So these are cheap microprocessors with microcontrollers. So like it's a 2-in-1. And again, this falls under the category of single board computers, but now they've become breadboardable. Feature phones, the ones which are non-smart, also have their own CPU, RAM, and flash ICs, power ICs, Bluetooth, and other things going on here. They also have this RTC that we talked about, a small battery to back up the clock in case you remove the main battery. So older feature phones look similar to the single board computers that we have. The smarter phones have multi-core and lots of different extra CPU. So hence I have not put it up here. Another device that falls in single board computer is a dash cam. The dash cam has a couple of extra features. One is they have their own battery, and the battery. So the intention of having battery on board, even though it is powered from the car battery, is when you turn off the car, you want the camera to keep recording for a while, even after that, in case you want to record. I want to keep the surveillance on in case of someone coming in and trying to break into your car and stealing something. You have the CPU and the RAM there, CPU and RAM and flash memory there. And obviously you have SD card where all the recordings are saved. Other than that, like in Raspberry Pi, you have a camera there, and the camera is engineered for this particular case where you have wide field of vision as you drive a car. You want the road and the various vehicles to be there. Recorded. Let's talk about conflict minerals. Most of our devices use small components which are surface mount devices so that they occupy a fewer space. So one of the most common use surface mount devices is tantalum capacitors. Tantalum is an element which most of it was found, the deposits of most of it is in Democratic Republic of Congo, but that particular country in Africa has been there has been conflict raging between various militant groups, and electronic manufacturers were trying to avoid sourcing material from there. Why do they still want to use tantalum capacitor if it comes from a place of conflict where people try to exploit each other and there are human rights abuses there? Is that tantalum capacitor actually outperform all other kind of capacitor? You can see the blue line here at the bottom for tantalum capacitor, and the other capacitor actually trail off at different, when you look at different features, but tantalum capacitor actually is consistent throughout the range of that particular feature. Electrolytic capacitors, for example, also are prone to bursting open and spewing their acid inside it over the circuit board, causing damages. So we still want to use tantalum capacitor, but we also don't want to want the local militants to buy weapons using the money they earn from exporting the ore. So what has happened in the last few years is people have started looking for deposit in other countries other than Africa. And there are some other countries, they better manage the mines and the conditions of the workers. So instead of now worrying about using tantalum capacitors in our devices, we can go ahead with it because most of these problems have now been avoided. People have stopped sourcing material from Democratic Republic of Congo and have started sourcing materials from other places. Now, Australia has a lot of lithium mines, but the problem with the deposits of tantalum capacitors in Australia is that it is inside hard rock. In case of Congo, it is inside soft soil, so it's easier to extract. And that is why when 20 years ago, when Australia was the only source of tantalum, people actually, miners and various companies actually flocked to Democratic Republic of Congo when they found out that it's easier to extract there, and it is much less economically feasible to extract in Australia. But Australia also has deposits of lithium, and as part of extracting lithium for lithium battery in electric cars, the byproduct is tantalum ore, which can now easily be extracted because the cost is now divided between extraction of lithium and extraction of cobalt. So now it's going to become economically feasible again for Australia to remove cobalt alongside lithium for electronics, especially electric vehicles and the car circuits, because the cars are also becoming smarter and people are consuming more and more electronics there. So it's really not a point of worry now to stop using tantalum capacitors. Finally, let's talk about digital SLR cameras. I'm not going to go too much in depth with this, just wanted to put up some photos so that you can appreciate what multidisciplinary design looks like. So when you open the camera, you have a lot of densely packed component inside. You have the circuit board with its Faraday cage, the metal box which prevents the RF emissions from outside impacting the camera, and you have lots of flexible PCB connectors which are called FPCs, going from various components, smaller circuit boards that host switches and dials into the main circuit board. So there are a few connectors here. You have to pry them open very slowly. But the point to appreciate is that a whole team of people sat down together, worked together to design not just the electronics, but the mechanical aspects of the device itself. There's optics, there is plastic components, metal components, all coming together. You probably need to design it on the computer, see everything fits together, then have multiple iterations of prototyping going on there. And the PCB itself, again, like a high-end single board computer. They have a chip which has been specifically designed for this particular camera with features and hardware which can help with taking a photo, doing the image processing, and so on. So Nikon has their own CPU going on. So you can imagine there is a whole team that sat down to design the chip, and then there was a whole team to design the CPU, but they all had to work hand in hand to make sure everything fits into a single enclosure. You can see again here, there's a small battery there, again for the RTC that I had mentioned earlier to maintain the clock. You have the RAM and the flash memory and so on. You also have a microcontroller that takes care of various power circuitry and the motor, the servo motor that moves the lens in and out. Again, Nikon has multiple, it just doesn't have the main processor, it also has some glue logic that it designed for its camera. So they have multiple chips going on there. If you try to open the remaining part of the camera, you'll see everything is well engineered. There are rubber components, plastic components, metal components, and these metal components are cut using CNC machine with precise dimensions. You have flash and the battery and so on. Optics as well. So if you just look closely, you will see there are small circuit boards here and there. So imagine having to design everything and having it fit all in a small box. I mean, you can't do this without the help of design software on computer. You have the image sensor. If you look at the image sensor, you will see the red dots, the blue, and the green dots. You can see the number of green dots are more because our eyes are more sensitive to green pixels, so green wavelength. So we want to capture as much of green as possible. We don't want to lose out on that information. Now, something similar to what this we at Tarana Wireless do, something similar to what this camera manufacturers do. We have a lot of processors going on. We design our own ICs. We design our own circuit boards. We design our own mechanical enclosures. The software that go inside the ICs were written by us. The chip that we designed was first prototype on FPGA. So our devices, we are into telecom sector. So our field is probably, known as software-defined radio. And in our case, the device has FPGA, DSP, and CPUs all working together in a single device. The task that needs to be done has been divided amongst different processors. And this is a basic outline of software-defined radio. So it's a big block diagram similar to what we do in our devices. Let's look at some of the circuit boards which are available to engineers for their own use for prototyping software-defined radios. So this is a board which it's called the Hack RF1. It's an open source board. People can buy it and write their own software. So you have the ARM processor and the FPGA here going on. So nowadays, the trend is moving towards having multiple processor in the system if there's a lot of complex mathematical calculations going on. There's another circuit board which has a DSP processor, probably a multi-core DSP processor and a high-end FPGA. And you have lots of memory, flash, and RAM going on for both the processors. So both the processors are supposed to work in tandem to achieve the task at hand. And like I said, most of these tasks involve lots of mathematical calculations. So you'll find them in digital, high-end digital cameras. You'll find them in telecom equipment that you see on cell phone towers. You'll find them in our devices as well. This is a block diagram of the same. All right, so that is the last of my slides. I'll leave links to my company's website here. In case any of this excites you, any of this is what you want to work towards, and you love solving challenges, you can also apply to our internship program, or even you can apply as a full-time engineer. So I've just put up the link here. Thank you. If I don't know if we are allowed to take questions, but if anyone has a question, you can type. I'll try to answer.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Anurag. So, participants, after such an exciting session, if you have any questions, any queries to ask Mr. Anurag, you can put it on the chat. Mohammed sir, you can please check the. Yeah, and participants, there is a feedback form which is the link is put on the chat by Mohammed sir. Please fill up that feedback form. Yeah, any questions? Yeah, Mr. Anurag, just one doubt I had.
Yes.
This you said the crystal frequency is 32.768. This one.
Yeah.
I mean, I understood that it's a power of 2, but is it something to do with that 1 kilo is 1024 and not 1000, which we.
No. So it's just like you're getting square waves out of the oscillator. So you get 32,768 waves, and you divide it by you pass it through the what do you say, the counter circuit, and then after 32,768 pulses, you'll get a high signal coming out of it because it's a 16-bit counter. So it's just binary 1 and 0. What you're talking about is probably applicable in the other slide that I showed about the Android TV, where we had 4 gigabits of flash memory. Instead of saying 4 gigabits of flash memory, we could have just divided by 8 and say it's 512 megabytes of memory. So we had 2 of those chips totaling for 1024 megabytes or 1 gigabyte.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So in case of oscillator, it's just the pulses. You just count as many pulses as you want for the power of 2.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
Yeah,
there is one question from Mr. Ganesh. How MBD and embedded systems interconnected?
Sorry, I don't know what MBD is actually.
Mr. Ganesh, can you please elaborate? What is MBD? Mr. Ganesh, you can just unmute and speak.
So while he types, I'll point out to something else as well. When I was in college, after my college was done, I was working at L&T, and most of the terminology that was spoken of was embedded systems. But nowadays, instead of saying embedded systems, we always talk about this Internet of Things, which is just nothing but embedded systems with added functionality to connect to the internet, be it through Wi-Fi or some other kind of wireless access. So nowadays, instead of you'll hear more of Internet of Things as compared to just embedded systems. And because the price of microprocessors have gone down drastically, you can get small PCBs or small circuit boards with Linux capable processors for a few hundred rupees. People have just started using Linux processor because of better security. So if you have Linux running, you can do HTTPS and TLS instead of just plain old HTTP and to send data over the internet. So it just makes more sense to have these cheaper microprocessors going on in there and fewer microcontrollers. So hence, because we are seeing a trend away from just microcontroller-based embedded systems towards Linux-based embedded systems, therefore it made sense to just start using the word Internet of Things.
Okay, I think Mr. Ganesh is not replying, so maybe. Yeah, any other question? Anybody has any doubt or query or anything to be asked?
Hello. Hello.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
My name is Vivekanand and I am from DNP Systems. We are in automation. We are using GPRS routers for communication and we are using PLCs. Is there any cheaper solution for this GPRS routers? Because nowadays we are buying GPRS routers; those are very costly. And any possibility having a small microprocessor connected where we can have RTU and integral GPRS modem.
Yeah. So let me show you a particular device. Control. So as I mentioned earlier, let me switch back to my slides. There are cheaper devices available now for you to develop your products on. And so this particular device has Wi-Fi inside it and a microcontroller inside it. It has a USB port. Because it has Wi-Fi, you can use those cheaper Vodafone dongles, which have their own Wi-Fi inside it. And if in a factory you have multiple PLCs and multiple devices that you want to connect to, you can have a Wi-Fi hotspot and all of these smaller devices connect to them. So this particular device has a small processor that runs at a few megahertz. It's 1,000 or 2,000 rupees, not very expensive. But because it's a made for breadboard, you need a device which has a proper enclosure. So this is one of them. It's called GL MiFi. It's made by a company called gl-inet.com. So I'll just post the link in the chat. And this has, you can insert a 4G SIM card in it. It has a Linux processor inside it. It has a USB port. So you can develop your own application. You can connect a USB to Modbus dongle here, have some application running inside. And this device you can choose your connectivity depending on your factory. So if you don't have Ethernet or Wi-Fi there, you can put a SIM card inside. But if you have Ethernet and Wi-Fi, which are cheaper forms of accessing the internet, you can connect the cable here. It has its own battery inside. So if there's a power failure, it'll keep running for some time. And you can write your programs, small C programs to collect data over the Modbus and upload it. There are lots of Linux libraries like libmodbus that will allow you to talk to your PLC if it is Modbus based. So it's just easier. I mean, this is similar to putting a Raspberry Pi and putting your software in there. But in case you don't even want to put your software there, a single device has its own Wi-Fi router, have a Wi-Fi, 4G, and Ethernet inside it, and it can automatically switch. So even if you don't want to put any software there, this is much better overall to manage. You can remotely log into it and do whatever kind of management you want. It's not cheap. It's still $100, I think, but um, it will require you to swap your existing system with this device. But a single device can actually talk to multiple PLCs and multiple sensors in the field. So overall, your system cost will decrease, but you'll have to put in some development effort there.
Well, you answered my question. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. Can it be used for industrial purpose? Like say there is a one ESR water tank in a society, and from there I'm mounting one level transmitter, and where I'm connecting this RTU and GPRS modem. So Raspberry Pi as a RTU and GPRS modem, can it be used for industrial purpose?
Yeah, exactly. So, but instead of Raspberry Pi has its own CPU in it, but you don't need this device and the Raspberry Pi. So this device has its own processor. So you can write the C
Okay.
program on the device itself. If you talk about the Raspberry Pi, that is also a good solution, only that you have to have a good enclosure for it. So if you have
Okay.
Raspberry Pi Zero, the one which is actually quite cheap, and let me show it here, it's easier. Yeah, so it has Wi-Fi in it, and if you just in the same small waterproof, weatherproof box, if you install a small dongle also, you can connect the dongle to using a USB OTG cable, or you can have a dongle which has Wi-Fi. So all that will be easier. Now, why I'm suggesting that you use Raspberry Pi is because you can write the code in Python, which is like immensely quick to do. And now the Linux which people have ported onto Raspberry Pi is actually quite stable. You can turn it on and leave it and keep running without rebooting or crashing or anything. So it's much easier. And if you still want to turn on and off relays, you'll get plugin boards for the Raspberry Pi which has a few relay on it. So you can turn the relay on off. The relay will turn the contactor on off, and you can turn the water pump on off using the contactor. So the number of components will decrease, and you'll just have a single board that you have to worry about. You don't have to worry about multiple things if you use the Raspberry Pi. If you're okay with writing code in C instead of C++, instead of Python, this device is much better because it already comes in an enclosure. You can put SIM card. If 4G network if Wi-Fi or network goes down, Ethernet goes down, it can switch to 4G automatically.
Okay, you answered my question, but it suits into the communication standards, which are IEC standards.
So, like I said, you have to write your own code for this. So there's a library to help you with Modbus interfaces. You put in a USB to RS485 dongle, and then you have to write the code for it. Similarly, in case of Raspberry Pi, you can use the same libraries, but in case of Raspberry Pi, you have Modbus libraries for Python also, and I'm sure for other field protocols as well. So to the Raspberry Pi, you can connect a kind of a USB dongle and interface it to your PLC, depending on the interface the PLC has. Nowadays, PLC also have network like Ethernet interface. So you can put the Raspberry Pi on the same local area network, then you can use Modbus RTU or some other Profinet or other field protocols to talk to your devices.
Okay, we are working more on digitization and database management. So I would like to get connected with you in future too.
Okay, I'll post my email address just in case anyone wants to reach out.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Mr.
Mr. Ganesh.
Yeah, Mr. Ganesh also send it basically for MBD. He is saying about model-based design using MATLAB and Simulink, how to connect that with that embedded system. He is trying to ask.
Okay. I'm not sure about MATLAB, but I'll point you to something else. This is a website, sorry, Renode.io. Now imagine you're working on a big project which involves multiple sensors out in the field. Maybe say you're developing an application where you are going to install meters. So you are a big builder and you want people to start having a green kind of a living. So you come up with a apartment complex where each flat has energy meter, electrical energy meter, gas meter, and water meter. So, and now you want all the participants to actually compete on decreasing their usage, and whoever decreases their usage the most decreases their carbon footprint, and they are competing on some kind of a social media gaming platform. So what you would need is a lot of sensors, which are some are sensing the flow of water, electricity, or gas, and you want to push them all into one place. So now, before you go and design the system, you will design a few nodes, few hardware devices, and in your lab, and all of them will be uploading uploading data to your cloud. But you actually want to simulate if your cloud stays stable when a lot of the devices are uploading data. So you want some way to simulate the whole system without actually creating hardware. So there's this open software called Renode.io. Platform.
Okay.
A lot of nodes, and those nodes can be programmed to send some random data or some algorithmic way of generating some data, and they hit your cloud software with it. So if you're designing embedded systems with connectivity, which is Internet of Things, and you want to simulate your project beforehand without actually working with the hardware. Hardware might come later on, and your software team who is working on the cloud wants some way to simulate everything. So Renode is the way to go. I'm not really sure about MATLAB, but if you have a large fleet of devices, this is the way to go. Other than that, if you have some algorithms that you want to put in the device, say for example, there's a device that detects some patterns in the electricity or electricity usage or some other kind of platform, and you have some embedded device which has a lot of computing power on it, and you want to run some algorithms, yes, MATLAB and Simulink can help you test those algorithms independently, just as a black box. MATLAB, I think it has a plugin to generate some C code for those particular algorithms that you can use in later on in your IoT edge computing. IoT devices which have a lot of processing power are called edge computers, because you can do AI and machine learning on those nodes. So I think that part can be done in MATLAB, but I'm not sure about simulating lots of nodes for your system to simulate your system. For that, you can use this. So this Renode has been in development for the last 10 years, and it works with all kinds of ARM-based products that you would be designing. So you can actually load code there. I mean, load your actual code that you're going to put in your hardware devices, and they will actually simulate those devices, and you can have your whole system simulated there.
Okay, we are slightly running short of time.
Yeah.
We need to conclude by because of time constraint from Zoom. So
Anyone else has
okay.
any other question, they can always email me, so I'll reply.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go to the conclusion part. So Mr. Anurag, I mean, I thank you very much for this. In fact, your session was very elaborating in not only embedded system but also in terms of product design. So it was a very nice thoughts into how an embedded system product can be designed, because I'm sure embedded system designers, embedded system engineers, many of them get into what is called as technopreneurship, that is entrepreneurship with embedded system products, and this is going to be very useful for them. So what I'll do is I will now hand over to Mohammed sir for a vote of thanks for this session. Over to Mohammed sir.
Okay, thank you, sir. Sir, Mr. Anurag sir, the lecture that you delivered was very informative, practical and thought-provoking. Means we learned a lot of things, especially the topic you chose was excellent, that whatever devices we use in our daily life, what are the things that are inside it. So, now we have learned a lot of things. So I would like to thank you on behalf of SIT and ENTC department for giving such a thought-provoking presentation. And also I would like to thank the audience. I hope that you have learned a lot of things and you are ready to open up devices at your home itself. And I would like to tell Anurag sir that we have also started an MTech embedded system program in Masters in Embedded System just this year. And hopefully we are trying to make the student industry ready. And the curriculum that we have designed, we have tried to take in, insights from the industry so that we can, design the syllabus accordingly. So hopefully this will help the students as well. And for all those, the questions which are left unanswered, you can mail us or even to Anurag sir, and he will surely reply. And thank you, sir.
Thank you. Yes.
I would also like to thank Dr. Paresh Nasikka, who connected us with Dr. Robin Patra, and through him we got connected to Mr. Anurag. So I thank Mr. Nasikka, Dr. Nasikka and Robin. Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Anurag. I actually handle industry connect in ENTC department. So I would like to keep connected with you, and you already have indicated possibilities of internship and things like that. So I will get in touch with you on this count, and I'm sure many positive things can happen with our interaction. Yeah.
Yes.
So
thank you.
yeah, thank you very much, and it was a very nice session, very elaborating, and lot many things were very useful for all the participants, I'm sure. So thank you for the nice session, all the participants, and we are ready to conclude now. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Anurag. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.